Hello, everyone. Welcome. We'll start in a few seconds. Let's just wait a bit until everyone connects. People are still getting to our webinar. So let's see. Hello there. Good afternoon from São Paulo, Brazil. Yes, if you can type in the name of your city you're connecting from, that will be great. Hello, Stephanie, Luciana. Hello from São Paulo. Yes, São Paulo as well. Let's see. Hey, hi, Michele. Hi, Alberto. Sertãozinho. Hello there. Porto Real, Rio de Janeiro. That's wonderful. Cascavel, Paraná. Rio de Janeiro, Brasília. That's wonderful. That's great. Capitólio, Minas Gerais. Wonderful. That's awesome. Welcome, everybody. I think we can make a start. So welcome again to another exclusive webinar for members of the Cambridge Biosite program. My name is Sergio Varela. I'm the product marketing manager responsible for the Cambridge Biosite program here at Cambridge in São Paulo, Brazil. And as we always say, our objective with this program is to offer you structured support, right? And especially in terms of teacher development. So that's why we are going to have this wonderful session today. And we have another special guest to talk to you today called Sergio Pantoja. But before I introduce Sergio, let me show you something. Let me just show you the homepage of the Cambridge Biosite program website, which is not completely ready yet. It's not live yet, but it will be soon live in a few days. So, of course, we'll let you know as soon as the website is live. But I just wanted to show you, a bit of the website and what you're going to see, what you're going to what you'll be able to find in this website. So you'll be able to check the newsletters, the exclusive webinars and interviews, texts about digital solutions, information about digital solutions and new business, some very nice experts tips on methodology and technology as well. You'll be able to select videos from a playlist, from a special playlist for the members of the program from the Cambridge YouTube channel. You'll be able to pick up some blog posts from our blog called Wobble, World of Better Learning, which has a lot of interesting articles and blog posts there. If you want to know about what is trending in the world, that would be a really nice option. And of course, you have access to our catalog and exams, especially in terms of teaching English to adults and young adults. Okay. So as soon as the website is ready, we'll let you know. Coming next in April, we are going to have a nice webinar about flipped classroom, right? This is going to be on April the 26th, and the speaker is going to be Alexandre Koch, who is one of our Cambridge academic consultants in the south of the country, right? So we'll let you know again via email and via our newsletters, our next newsletter about this new exciting webinar, exclusive webinar for the members of the Cambridge Biosite program. And today, we have the pleasure to have Sergio Pantoja with us. And the webinar is called Overcoming the Intermediate Plateau. Well, with over 2 decades of experience in the ELT field, Sergio Pantoja has worked as a teacher trainer, and speaking and writing examiner. He holds, among others, a degree in languages, a postgraduate degree in English language teaching and translation, a TESOL certificate from the University of Oregon in the United States, the C2 Proficient Certificate, CPE, and the Delta. His Delta Module 3 specialist focused on LDT, language development for teachers. And Sergio is also the author of 3 published books already. How nice is that? So you'll be able to interact with Sergio during the webinar using the chat box, but please leave the Q&A for questions at the end, okay, as we always do. So at the end, we'll put a link in the chat box to a feedback form, which is very important for our work. So if you could please fill up this feedback form, it always helps our work here at Cambridge. And then you'll be able to download your certificate, which is a PDF document. You just put in your name and save it, and that's it. You have your certificate. Okay, so welcome, Sergio. It's a pleasure to have you here, and it's over to you. Thank you.
Hi, Sergio. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Let me start by sharing my screen with you. I can see that we have people here from many different parts of Brazil. That's amazing. Right. Please let me know if you can see, if everybody can see my screen before I continue.
Yes, it's okay. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Right. So today we're going to be talking about how to help students overcome the intermediate plateau. Roberto says so many Sergios. That's true. Can be a bit confusing. I would like to show you 3 statements and ask you what they all have in common, starting with the first one. And this is something that I believe you've already heard from your students, especially when they reach a certain level of proficiency. My English has stopped improving. Have you ever heard that? If so, can you please type yes in the chat box? I bet you have. Definitely. Okay. Now, let's try to think of other areas of our life. So you start going to the gym, you are working out, you are eating healthy, but after some time, you notice that you have stopped gaining muscle. Or by the same token, you have stopped losing weight despite dieting and exercising. Now, if you look at these 3 examples, even though only the first one is related to language learning and the other 2 are related to different areas of our life, they all have something in common, right? Which is, you can write in the chat if you have already figured it out. Let me see if somebody's going to get it. Oh, great. Alberto says they have reached a plateau. Yes, absolutely. So in all these examples here, even though the first is only the first one, right, is related to learning a language, but in all of them, people stopped making progress. They have reached a plateau. And this is called the plateau effect, right? So in a nutshell, we can visualize it in a very simple way if you look at this graph. Normally, when you start an activity, and we need to think of it in terms of ability and time. When you start a new activity, and it doesn't have to be learning another language, it could be, for example, when you learn how to swim or do something that develops as a skill. Normally, what happens is at the beginning of it, we feel that we develop really fast. So in a very short period of time, as we don't know much, sometimes we don't know anything about that new activity, we notice that after a couple of months or in a very short time, we make a lot of progress. But what happens is, as time goes by, we notice that at the beginning, we've made a lot of progress, but then after a while, we notice that we're not making progress as fast. And that's when we reach this plateau. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, how to help students overcome when they get stuck at this point, when they reach a plateau. In 2008, Jack Richards, the famous Jack Richards, wrote a paper called Moving Beyond the Plateau. Has anybody here ever read this paper? Have you ever heard of it? You can use the chat. Never. Okay. Right. If you have never heard of it, you can find it online actually for free. It's on the Jack Richards website. And in this paper, he talks about some of the things we can do to help students overcome the intermediate plateau. Today, we're going to be focusing on 3 strategies that he mentions in this paper, and that I've been using for some years to help students. The first one of them is related to challenges. So I decided to focus on the 3 main challenges that normally students have once they reach the intermediate plateau. The first one of which is that there is a gap between receptive and productive competence. Now, what does it mean? Basically, students, when they reach an intermediate level of proficiency, they feel that they can understand a lot of English. So even though listening can still pose a challenge, they notice that when they listen to people talking or when they have to interact with other speakers, they can understand most of what people are saying. So receptively speaking, things are okay. I mean, even though there is room for improvement, of course. But productively, so especially in terms of speaking, they feel that they still need to improve. So it creates a gap between how they perceive listening or reading, for that matter, because they're both receptive skills, and speaking and writing, which are productive skills. The question here is, how can we help students bridge this gap from the receptive and productive competence to make them like closer to each other? Let me give you an example. One of the points he makes in the paper is that, and this is very important because this is it's related to how we see receptive and productive skills. But he makes the point that recent theories of second language acquisition no longer assume that productive skills will arise naturally from comprehension skills. In other words, students are not going to get better at speaking or writing only through exposure. So just by listening to English or by reading English, we cannot expect that automatically the other skills, the productive ones, are going to become better. So he says that basically there are 2, oh, Sergio has already shared the link here. Thank you, Sergio. So basically he says that if we are to help students improve, there are 2 other factors that are necessary to reduce this gap between receptive and productive competence. And the 2 strategies he mentions are noticing and focused output. We're going to start with noticing. Is this a term that everybody here is familiar with? Have you heard this term noticing before? Or is this new to you? Samili says, not in this context. Mm-hmm. New for me. Okay. So let's define noticing. What Jack Richards here means by noticing is the ability of paying attention to language. It's not just exposure. And I think this is a common misconception. It's not just about it's not just, of course, that exposure is very important, but it's not just about exposing students to new language. It goes further. The idea here is to help students pay attention to language deliberately. So it's not by accident. We're doing it on purpose. In other words, we want to draw their attention to certain features. It could be something related to a grammatical structure or some vocabulary items. in the context of whatever we're teaching. It could be a listening exercise, a reading exercise, or we can even help students become better at noticing language when they read. So when they're at home, for example, when they're reading a book, sometimes they are reading and they're not paying to how language is used. Of course, that normally we read for pleasure because we want to get something out of a book. But if we were to use reading as a way of improving our English, one of the things we need to do is to be good at noticing, noticing how language is used. And some students are not very good at that. But this is one of, I would say that this is one of our most important jobs in the classroom, to help students become better at noticing language. And how can we do that? Of course, we can do that in many different ways, but I would like to give you an example, a practical one. Thornbury says that one of the teacher's key roles is to facilitate the process of noticing. In other words, to help students become better at understanding how language is used. And then we get into two important concepts here, input and intake. Let's say that in the classroom, when you do with your students a listening exercise, so they have to listen to the recording or to the conversation. Normally we ask them to listen and answer some questions like listening for gist or listening for detail. So what we're giving them is input, right? So the language we expose students to is the input they're getting. But Jack Richards makes a distinction between helping students get intake out of the input. So before we go any further, let me ask you a question here. Is anybody familiar with the meaning of intake, what intake is? Or is this a new concept to you? New for me? No. New. Okay. New. Okay. So let's clarify the difference between input and intake. Intake is what students are going to get out of the input. Let me give you an example, or what we expect them to get out of it. We're not going to do this activity, but let's say you're my students and we're going to do this exercise. This exercise consists of a short recording in which you're going to hear a woman talking about her expectations of a round-the-world trip. Then there is a question here for you. How does the speaker say she felt when planning her trip? And there are three options. Okay, let's say that we do this exercise and then I play the recording and then you listen to it and you are able to choose the correct answer. Normally what we do in the classroom is, okay, we students do the listening exercise and we check the answers. If everything is fine, we move on. But if we do that and we don't help them notice, again, pay attention to certain like language features in the input is not likely to become intake. So let me stress this point again because it's very important. So input is all the language students are being exposed to. In the context of this exercise, here I have provided with the script. So everything that the speaker said is the input, right? So this is the input. But we're not going to have time to look at all the script, but I'm going to draw your attention to some parts of it. In this script here, there are certain words and certain expressions that I want my students to pay attention to. I want them to notice. And these are nagging doubts, got my goat, get carried away, fork out, and hefty sum. Okay. I would say that if we don't make like an effort to help students notice this language from the input, most probably this would go unnoticed. They're going to listen to the recording, they're going to answer the questions, and probably they're going to get it right. We're going to move on, and they won't have the chance to pay deliberate attention to these features of the input. So if I want my students to notice this in the hope that this will become intake, And then again, we go back to that point, right? What's the difference between input and intake? So intake is what I expect students to get out of the input. So I want them to act on it. And in this case, I want them to understand these expressions. Nagging doubts, got my goat, get carried away, fork out, and hefty sum. So as a teacher, I need to think about what can I do to help them notice this language. And there are many activities and many tasks you can design in order to help them notice. I'm going to show you one that I use very often. I like to use this. I believe that most of you here use course books, don't you? Can you write yes or no in the chat whether you use a course book or not? Yes. Okay, a lot of yeses. Yes, yes. Interchange, yes. Now more often. Okay, thank you. So if you use a course book, your course book has a script, right? And I really like to explore the script because normally what happens is, of course, that the main purpose of a listening activity is to help students become better listeners, right? We use the listening activities to get them to develop certain listening sub skills. But there's so much more we can explore. When you look at the script, sometimes you find nice expressions that students could learn. And if we don't do something to get them to notice the language in the input, and we just move on to the next exercise, they're going to be missing out here nice opportunities. So I often explore the script very, very often. So how can I get students to notice these expressions? Something very simple you can do, because the idea here is not to reinvent the wheel, right? We are teachers and we don't have a lot of free time. So the easier, the better, is to provide them with a script. And then those expressions that I want them to notice, I create like a gap fill exercise. And then I play the recording again. As they listen to the recording, they need to complete with part of the expression they're missing. So this part that's missing is the one that's going to complete the expression. By the time they do this exercise, they will have noticed the expression that I want them to. It's very, very simple, right? You can use the script itself to do it. And this is the first part. So this is the noticing aspect. But remember that Richards mentions two things. Let me go back to that slide just to remind you of the two terms. He mentions noticing as one of the things we can do to help students, but there's something else, focused output. Because noticing, even though they are paying attention deliberately, like it's not accidental, it's still very passive, isn't it? In the sense that they're not doing anything with this new language. They paid attention to it, they understood it, but they're not actually using it. That's why Richard talks about combining noticing with focused output. So how does it work? And just out of curiosity here, if you want to go deeper into this notion of focused output, you can Google Swain. Swain 2000 talks about it, the importance of focused output. But let me give you an example, a practical example. Once the students have focused on the expressions, or in this case, I'm focusing on expressions, but it could be a grammatical structure, for example, like something like third conditional or past perfect. Once we draw their attention to it, then the next step is how can we get them to use it? When students produce language, we often use the term output, right? There is the input and the output. But mind you that Swain uses here the term focused output. So it's not just any input. Not any output. It's focused output. Now, what does it mean? If you're my students and you had just listened to that conversation and then we worked on helping you notice the expressions, and I wanted to practice this, I could ask you, for example, to summarize what the speaker said. I mean, that's a good speaking activity, right? So they can listen again, they can take notes to help them, and now they're going to summarize what the speaker said. I would say that's a great activity if you want to help students become better at summarizing. The problem is they can summarize the whole thing the speaker said without actually using the expressions that we help them notice. So how can we make sure that as they summarize, the text or the conversation or whatever you ask them to summarize, they're going to try to use the new language. Something that I like to do is to ask them to summarize what they heard, but as they do it, try to use the new expressions. So in the context of this exercise, they would have to think about, okay, how can I summarize what the speaker said? But at the same time, as I do it, I'm going to try and use nagging doubts, got my goat, get carried away, and so on and so forth. In this case, the output they're generating, it's not just output, but it's an output focused on the language that we had them notice previously. So it's a way of pushing them. Now, this is something important because depending on the level of students you use it, this lesson was used with students at C2 level of proficiency. But if you're going to use it with, let's say, students who are at B2 level of proficiency, maybe you're going to have to make some adjustments. What kind of adjustments? You can get them to plan how they're going to summarize it by giving them time to prepare. So you're going to summarize what the speaker said, and you have, let's say, 2 minutes to think about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. So you give them preparation time. So by the time they start summarizing it, they are going to have something to hold on to. In this case, it could be, for example, notes that they took, or maybe a structure that they create. First, I'm going to talk about this, then about that, because this exercise is not easy, right? They're doing 2 things at the same time. On the one hand, they're thinking about how they can express the ideas they heard. So they're, juggling the ideas and all the information they got from the recording. And on the other hand, they're trying to use the new language. So sometimes preparation time can be really useful here because there are 2 things that they need to juggle: the new language as well as the information that they need to share. So this is something for us to take into consideration. But then your students better than anyone, right? So if your students, if you can push them further, or if you need to, provide them with some scaffolding so you can help them carry out this task. But anyway, this is a great way of getting students to use the new language. Obviously, there are different ways you can ask them to create questions using the new language, because the main point here is to find ways to help them produce this new language, that's why it's called focused output, right? Because it's going to be focused on a particular target language, be it vocabulary or grammar. And this leads us to the next challenge, which is challenge number 2. Fluency may have progressed at the expense of complexity. I'm pretty sure that you've already had students who, by the time they reach intermediate level of proficiency, they can express their ideas quite well. I mean, they can get their message across. But then you notice that even though there is flow, like they sound fluent, they often rely on very basic level structures. Sometimes they even make lots of mistakes. Like mistakes are made in order to sacrifice fluency. So clearly these 2 things, fluency and complexity, don't always go hand in hand. Is it something you have already noticed when it comes to your students? Dari says yes, very common. Yes. Eduardo says, most of my students come to me like this. Okay, I can see that a lot of you have already experienced that. Samiri says, absolutely, I have these students don't really know how to help her. Yes, this is something quite common, I would say. So they sound fluent because they're able to keep the language flowing, like there is a flow of language. But at the same time, when we pay attention to the words they're using, the structures they're using, we can see that they lack complexity. And even Richards, in this 2008 article, he mentions that ideally, fluency, accuracy, and complexity develop in harmony. But this is not always the case. And as teachers, we absolutely know that that's not often the case. And then it raises the question, right? What can we do to help students, especially students who have reached this intermediate level of proficiency and got stuck? complexify the language they're using. An important point is important to be, it's important to be made here. When I say complexify the language, I'm not talking about speaking like Shakespeare. What I'm talking about here is how can we help our students be more precise, communicate more effectively. It's not just about using those obscure words for the sake of using crazy words. That's not about it. It's really about if they want to express an idea, for example, which is more nuanced, they are able to do it because they are able to choose the right words or use the right structures. So that's what I mean by complexifying. Now, I think that one thing we need to keep in mind is in our lessons, when we teach students who have reached this level, what opportunities do we have or can we create for complexifying, to help students complexify? If you think of a task or an activity, let's say our students are going to do a speaking activity. So we can think of things we can do before the task, before they do the task, and things they can do after they do the task. Let me give you examples. Right. If students are going to do, let's say they're going to do a speaking activity, which requires them to make suggestions. So what they need to do is to offer suggestions, make suggestions. Normally that kind of, functional language we see in course books. We often have things like give advice or invite someone to do something or make a complaint. So we often have language that performs a certain function. Something we can do is get students to listen or watch, if you have a video, it's even better, more competent users of English. And I'm not just talking about native speakers of English. I'm talking about people who have a higher level of proficiency, doing the same thing, completing the same task. And how can it help them complexify the language they're using? Because and this is very common if you use a task-based learning approach, right? To get students to focus on how other people would complete the same task. So then they can pay attention to how they did it, and then they consider how they are going to do it. So to give you an example, if they're able to listen to other people performing a similar task or watch other people performing a similar task, they can notice, for example, the language they used, the structures they used. And if you don't have, in case you don't have access to listening activity or a video activity that shows the students what they can do, the task they're going to do before they do it, something you can do is to elicit from them, right? So we're going to carry out this task. What kind of language can you use to say this or to say that? So this is a way of getting them to prepare and think about their word choices, their grammatical structures, and a way of helping them complexify the language they're using because they have thought about it in advance. Of course, that in the classroom, there is room for spontaneity. It goes without saying, right? So sometimes we want them to do something more spontaneously. That's absolutely fine. But if the idea is to help them complexify the language they're using, we can help them prepare, right? So this is one idea. Another idea is one that we can do after the first time they do the task. Scott Thornbury, he very often he talks about the importance of task repetition. So students do an activity, like a speaking activity, and then we change one tiny little aspect by making it a little bit more challenging and ask them to do the same activity again, but normally with a twist, because otherwise it can be a little bit boring if we just ask them to repeat the same activity. So you can add one element to it. Maybe you can give them, for example, less time, or you can add something else that they should do. But as you are repeating the task, at least the core of it, with some elements modified, as they've done it before, so the first time they normally focus on getting it done. And when we ask them to repeat, as they've done that before, they are more familiar with the task, which means that they are going to feel more confident. They're more comfortable with it. And then they can focus more on the language they're going to use. Because it's not easy, right? As I said before, to juggle these two things. Normally you have a task to accomplish, and at the same time, they have to think about the language they're going to use. So having them repeat the task is a way of focusing more on the language they're going to use, because now they've already accomplished it, so they know what they need to do. So that's another strategy we can use for the sake of complexifying language. Number 3, this is another example of something we can do. Let's say our students, they're going to do something that's related to renting an apartment. They can read advertisements before. And as they read this advertisement for apartments, they can focus on the language that comes from this advertisement. So chunks, vocabulary, and then they can think about how they can use some of that language or words or expressions when they do the activity. So let's say it's a role play and they're going to have to talk to each other. One is going to be calling the apartment owner to discuss the rent. So before we ask them to do it, they can have access to the language that's normally used in this context, and then they can try and incorporate some of these language in their role play. So it's also a way of helping them complexify. Something we can do that's very simple is to get students, this is the one I mentioned before, to elicit, to help learners with not just the language, but also ideas, because ideas can be very problematic, right? Especially when we teach teenagers or younger learners. Normally, they don't know what to say. And it's not just a question of English that they don't know the words or the expressions. The problem is they don't have ideas because they haven't had much life experience. So it's important to think about how we can help them not only with the language, but also with the ideas they need to accomplish the task. And if we do that beforehand, before asking them to do the task, but by the time they do the task, hopefully they're going to be more confident to try more complex language. Last but not least, we can give them time to plan. This is what I mentioned in relation to that activity that students were supposed to summarize what they heard. Because when the students have time to plan, they can focus on those two different aspects: what they're going to say, how they're going to say it. And then planning can give them the opportunity to think about, okay, I'm going to try to use this expression or that expression. So these are some of the things we can do in order to help students complexify the language they're using. There are many others, of course, but these 5 ideas can be very helpful. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the role of the teacher. Ken Lackman wrote an article for the Modern English Teacher magazine. No, sorry, English Teaching Professional magazine in 2007, where he talks about the role of the teacher in the classroom as a source of language. And this is something that I often discuss with other teachers, right? Because if you're teaching students who are at intermediate level, let's say B1 or B2, and we often tell them that they've been overusing certain words. And this is true, right? This is something that often happens. So normally they tend to overuse certain adjectives like good, interesting, nice. And then we tell them that one of the things they should do is to think about how they can broaden their repertoire. They can use like their range of vocabulary. Now, I think this is important, but as teachers, I strongly believe that if we want students to try and use more complex language, we should use more complex language ourselves. Does it mean, for example, that we should speak English in the classroom in a way that nobody's going to understand what you're saying? Absolutely not. But what I'm saying is, if I expect my student to go beyond interesting, good, and nice, maybe I should start using words that are slightly different to get them to notice, my own choices. I remember, for example, teaching this group of B2 level learners, and that's interesting because not everybody's going to notice, but there's always a student who's going to notice that. we're talking about a movie, and then I said that the movie was really riveting. I used the word riveting. And then one of the students said, what did you say? I said, riveting. What does that mean? It's very, very interesting. So when we start using words like during the lessons in the classroom that are slightly above the student's current level of proficiency, normally they're going to start paying attention to those words. And I think it's a way of showing them that they can go beyond the lexical choices that they've been using. But I think it starts with the teacher. I really believe that. If we want students to go beyond, we should go beyond. Let me give you an example of how, as teachers, we can help students complexify the language they're using. Recently, a lot has been discussed about dealing with emergent language in the classroom, right? In case you're not familiar with it, it's when students use they use like it could be grammar, it could be related to vocabulary, it could be even related to the mistakes. So they say something that was not really actually planned. So let's say that for a particular lesson, our goal was to teach the present perfect. So that was the goal of the lesson. But then as students start talking to each other, they use something that wasn't part of what we had planned, but they ask you a question like, how can I use this or how can I use that? So this is what we describe as emergent language. So unplanned language that often happens during the lesson. I think this is a great opportunity for us to help students complexify their language. So take a look at this dialogue between a teacher and a student named Joanna. The teacher asks Joanna, do you find technology to be pervasive in your daily life? And then the student asks, what do you mean? And the teacher rephrases the question. Is technology everywhere and involved in most aspects of your day? So note that the teacher defined the meaning of the word pervasive, right? Because apparently Joanna didn't understand the word pervasive. So the teacher paraphrased it. And then she says, yes, definitely. But the teacher insists, besides technology, what else can be described as pervasive in your daily life? So sometimes as teachers, if we get students to, sometimes we're going to have to push a little bit to force them to notice the new language. Because otherwise what happens is, it's very similar to when you are reading a book, isn't it? You're reading a book and you encounter a new word. And then you understand the word because you have context. What do we often do? We move on. So rarely do we stop to say, okay, I don't understand this word. Let me go deeper into it. Let's see what it means. Let's see how it can be used. So here the teacher really insisted on having Joanna understand pervasive. And this is something we can do. And when I started doing it, I'm going to be very honest with you. When I started doing it, sometimes I had to think about the different words that I was going to use during the lesson. When I started teaching more advanced students, I always try to use more advanced vocabulary as I was talking to them. But sometimes this is something that you probably know very well, right? Sometimes the more advanced words don't emerge naturally. So I would plan. So when we talk about this, I'm going to ask students a question using this word. So one way of making sure that we're going to use more advanced words or expressions during the lesson is to plan. So then when you ask students, you can try and use that word or that expression to get them to notice it. Here's another example of a teacher trying to get students to notice something more advanced. So the teacher asks, Pedro, do you think the article exhibits media bias? Pedro doesn't quite understand that. He says, media what? The teacher replied, media bias. Was the article unfair in its presentation? So once again, the teacher explains the meaning of the word. Pedro replies, yes. And then the teacher insists, so you believe it did exhibit media bias? And Pedro says, yes, it showed media bias. Can you give me another example of a situation where bias might be present aside from the media? So to wrap it up, I think that as teachers, we can play a very important role when it comes to introducing new words, new expressions, new structures, especially when dealing with intermediate, upper intermediate students, because they can handle it, right? I totally understand that when we start teaching beginners, we have to rough tune the language we use. We have to simplify it. Otherwise, they're going to struggle to understand what you're saying. But as we start teaching more advanced students, I think that it's also, in a way, our job to start introducing more advanced English, even in our speech, like gradually. All right, I'm going to try to keep an eye here in the chat. Great. So far, so good. I believe so. Great, yes. Let's move on to the third challenge. The third challenge that Jack Richards mentions in the paper is the fact that students reach an intermediate level of proficiency and they still have a limited vocabulary range, which is pretty much related to what we're discussing, right? Overusing the same words again and again and again. Julian says that it makes total sense. Once students manage to communicate, to convey their ideas with a restricted vocabulary, they may not feel the need to incorporate new terms, which is like the law of least effort, right? If people can understand what I'm saying, I mean, why should I complexify it? Why should I, try to be more specific, more precise, if people get what I'm saying? But then, if they keep doing that, chances are that their English is not going to improve because they're always using the same structures, the same language. And Julian says that they reach a lexical acquisition plateau. We're still talking about the same problem, but now more focused on the issue of vocabulary. And then Julia says that they continue to use generic terms, which fail to precisely communicate the intended message. And then as a result, they keep overusing words like nice, instead of something more specific as friendly or lovely, delicious, or pleasing. Because nice can help them in most situations. So they don't push themselves to use something more precise. The thing is, if you look at the number of words that students need to learn in order to reach a certain level of proficiency, needless to say, we're going to see that they need to learn a lot of words. O'Keefe talks about a range from 5,000 to 6,000 words of receptive vocabulary, which appears to be a good threshold at which they consider to be at the top of intermediate level. Now, if we consider something between 5,000 or 6,000 words, and the number of hours students have, like the number of lessons they have, you're going to notice that it's not easy to learn 5,000 words. Mind you that here it says receptive vocabulary, right? So obviously it doesn't mean that students are able to use 5,000 words productively, but receptively, they have amassed from 5,000 to 6,000 words. But consider a typical student of English, like this. Let's say that they study English 2 hours per week. In 1 year, they will have had 80 hours, right? 2 hours per week, 8 hours per year. Because most English courses are like what, 40 hours per semester. So 2 semesters, 8 hours, give or take. Now, let's be over optimistic here. If we teach students 10 words per lesson, and not only teach, let's hope that they're going to memorize these 10 words. So we teach them words, and in the perfect world, they memorize 10 words. After 1 year, right, in this hypothetical scenario, they will have learned 800 words. Still, it would take them 7 years to reach 5,000 words, this range from 5,000 to 6,000. So clearly, if they only depend on the teacher and on their lessons to boost their vocabulary, it's going to take them forever, right? I mean, we can do as much as we can, but there's only so much we can do. So it goes without saying that students need to study outside the classroom. They need to get exposure to English outside the classroom. And then as a result, they're going to learn more words. So improving their vocabulary, learning more words, it's not something that's only going to take place in the classroom. They need to continue doing that once they're out of the classroom. Now, in the classroom, what can we do to help students improve their vocabulary as effectively as possible? Thornbury talks about the likelihood of a word being integrated into our mental lexicon if many decisions have been made about it. Now, what is the implication here? The implication here is if students are exposed to new words, and then they do like one exercise, some books, they provide students with like a gap fill exercise. Students read the sentences, complete the gaps, and then we move on to something else. We don't have a lot of decisions, right? I mean, not a lot of decisions are made when we complete the gap fill exercise with the words. So what can we do to get students to make more decisions, to manipulate, to experiment with this new language? So then a lot of decisions can be made, and hopefully the new words can be easily integrated into their lexicon. There is something called decision-making tasks. How can we use decision-making tasks in our lessons without having to reinvent the wheel, as I said before? If you use a course book, you may find yourself having to adapt it, which is absolutely fine, right? Because no course book is perfect. There's no such thing as the perfect course book. There are great course books, of course, but as we have students with different needs, we may find ourselves having to adapt the course book, which is absolutely fine. But how can we do this? I'm going to give you an example using authentic material, but this is easily applicable to course books too. Once I was reading an article about study casts doubt on assumption that nice people finish last in the workplace. And as you know, as teachers, we're reading stuff and we're always paying attention to how we can use it in the classroom. Then I was reading this article and I noticed that this article is full of words, vocabulary to describe personality. So you have ruthless, nice, deceitful, aggressive, generous, trustworthy, hawkish, disagreeable, dominant, aggressive, communal, and also generous again. So as you can see, this article is filled with words that can be used to describe personality. As soon as I noticed that, I immediately thought, okay, how can I use this with one of my students? And here's what we did. Of course, that I gave them a couple of questions for them to read the text, a purpose for them to read the text and get the main idea, like a gist task, and then to read it again and answer some questions to get the details out of the task. So I'm going to go straight to the part that we focused on vocabulary. The first exercise that I designed was to get them to go over the text again and find 10 adjectives that describe personality and behavior. You see, I didn't ask them to, I didn't give the words to them. I didn't say, no, underline this, this, and that word. I had them go over and see if they could find the new words for themselves. Why? Because when they go over the task and they need to think about, okay, does this word or can this word be used to describe personality or behavior? They're making a decision, right? Since we're talking about the importance of using more decision-making tasks in our lessons, this is the first one. So go over the task, try to find the words. So there's a decision there. They need to decide which words can be used to describe personality. So this was task number one. Task number two, once they found the words, we checked, I gave them a new task. This task consisted of having students to decide whether the words they found express positive ideas or negative ideas. So what I wanted them to do was to focus on what we call connotation, right? We often say, this word has a positive connotation, this word has a negative connotation. So using the context, they had to decide whether the adjective was used to describe something positive or something negative. Of course, that some words are very easy, like generous, so we know it's positive. But others, like hawkish, for example, or even ruthless, they were in doubt. So I had them use the context to make this decision. And then we checked. Then we moved on to another task, number 3. In this task, I decided to focus on collocations. So I provided them with a group of words, like each group with 3 words. For example, ambition, dictator, businessman, group 1. Behavior, heart, words, group 2. And information, friend and source, group 3. And they had to choose the adjective that collocates, that goes with all the words in the group. So the idea here, as you can imagine, was to expand their knowledge, so then they could not only focus on the word itself, but the words that frequently go with it. And then task 4, which was the last one, they had to choose 3 adjectives from the text and think about people they know, 3 people they know, and choose adjectives that, in their opinion, describe those people, and think about the reasons why. So they had to justify their choices. For instance, my uncle is really trustworthy because, and then they had to provide a reason for that. Now, in this lesson, they went through 4 different tasks to get them to work on the new language, the new vocabulary, and all of them, all the 4 tasks, they require students to make decisions, different decisions. Find the adjectives, they had to read and decide the words that describe personality. That's a decision. Put the adjectives in groups, so using the context. Is it positive? Is it negative? Another decision. Match the adjective with the noun. So does this adjective collocate with this word? Or in all the 3 words, there's another decision to be made there. And last but not least, they had to choose 3 adjectives and decide the ones that describe people they know and why. So throughout this lesson, you see, they were not only exposed to the new words and did like a get-to exercise, they had many opportunities to manipulate, experiment with the words, in the hope that they're going to incorporate these adjectives more easily. So that was the point. So this is something I believe we can do. The ideas here, I'm going to be very honest with you. I got these ideas from course books. So all these tasks that I designed based on that article were ideas that I got from course books. You have probably seen many times, right? In course book exercises, asking students to put words into different categories, or to match words with collocations, or to choose a number of words and think about what they can describe. So basically what I did was just to adapt. I got the idea from the course book and adapted it to provide students with more opportunities to use the words. In case you were wondering the kinds of exercises you can use, well, there are many options, right? You can use matching exercises. We can have students, for example, rank words from, let's say, the most important to the least important, or in terms, for example, this is an exercise I used the other day. At the end of the lesson, students, they had been exposed to 8 different words in that lesson. And then I had them to rank the words from the most difficult, it was like a personal decision, to the least difficult. So they had to think about, for example, which word will probably be harder for me to use? Is it because of the pronunciation? Is it because of the meaning? Is it because of the use? Because that's the idea, is to get them to think about the words and make decisions. Identifying, which is example number 1, right? When I asked them to find the words in the text. Sorting, like categorizing into different groups. And selecting, so basically choosing words. All these 5 activities are very common in course books. And once you start, at first it may not be that easy, but once you start designing tasks and experimenting with different tasks, it becomes very easy for you to supplement the course book if necessary. Right, so these are the references. All the references I've mentioned you can find here. I believe that I'll be able to share this with you. And now let's see if we have questions. Stop sharing.
Thanks a lot, Sergio.
My
Very nice
pleasure, Sergio.
presentation. Yeah, very good insights and awesome ideas. As always, we have two questions in the question and answer box. One from Jerusa Rafael. She says, "Is writing sentences a good activity to practice new vocabulary?"
Yeah, I believe it is. I think there's just one thing that we need to consider before we ask students to write sentences, because sometimes what happens is they can write a sentence, but if they haven't had the opportunity to get to know the word, because I use this term because you encounter a word once and then you create a relationship with it, right? So sounds a bit poetic, but you start to get to know the word. I think that the problem is if students are not so familiar with the new word and we ask them to write a sentence, they may use it in a way that is wrong. So maybe you can do this exercise, for example, to check whether students can use the word naturally or not. But if they're not familiar with it, they can still make mistakes. So this is something to consider. It is a way of practicing, but I would say that they're very likely to misuse it if they haven't had a lot of exposure, familiarity with the word.
Great. We have another question from Samili. During the collocation activity you mentioned, are the students allowed to use a dictionary, or were they supposed to guess?
Samir, in that exercise, I didn't ask them to use the dictionary. They were supposed to guess. What I was hoping them that they could be able to do as they did that exercise, there were 3 words, right, in each group. So at least one of them was easier than the others. So I was hoping that once they identified one word, they could use the other words to make the connection. But I don't think there is a problem if you allow them to use a dictionary to do research and find the words. I think that they can really profit from it. But in that particular activity, they couldn't use it. They had to use their intuition.
Okay. Another question from Eduardo Alexandre Azevedo. With the students in the intermediate plateau who mostly search for conversational classes, some tips to perform more with them? Some tips to perform more with them?
Searching for conversation lessons.
Conversational classes, yes.
Eduardo, I think that there is a potential problem we may have with students who are looking for conversation lessons is that they just want to spend most of the class talking. And I think that if they just, they come to the lesson and they talk for like an hour and we don't do anything in terms of language development, it may become like practice for the sake of practice. They're going to be practicing English, but it doesn't mean they're going to be getting new words and new expressions. So I think that something we can do is to make sure that in this conversation lesson, we expose them to some sort of input that is going to allow them to learn new words and new expressions. So they're not just practicing English, but they're going to keep learning and keep improving. Does it make sense? Yes, great.
Okay. Let me just see whether we have any other questions. No, actually, there's one question for me, if I may. Still have time. I think it was Eloisa that said in the chat box that she recorded herself once and she discovered that, or part of her class, she recorded part of her class, and she discovered that she was repeating the word very, very much. Yeah. And as you said, sometimes teachers they kind of get this plateau themselves. So do you think class observation or having someone to observe your classes or maybe record your classes from time to time is a good idea for you to realize whether you are repeating yourself very much or and get some insights from your own classes? Do you think that's a good idea?
Absolutely. Even if you don't like use a camera to record it as a video, but the audio, like if you're able to record it to get the audio out of your lesson, and then you can listen to you. I mean, the way you interact with your students, you may realize that you are overusing words, or perhaps you're not even overusing words, but you use language that's too simple all the time.
Mhm.
And then I think it's a way of, getting us to notice the language that we've been using as teachers. Because sometimes that's a good question, Sergio. It's not always clear, right? Because there's so many things we're thinking about, like the exercise, giving instructions, monitoring, thinking about the feedback we're giving, that there are so many things that we're paying attention to at the same time that we may like neglect the language, that we use, because we're prioritizing other things. But once you record yourself, or maybe you have someone observe your lessons, they can notice these blind spots. So things that normally go unnoticed.
That's awesome. We still have time for one question. I have a question from Alberto Costa. Alberto says, expanding one's lexicon is crucial to allow them to go beyond the plateau. This doesn't mean only learning X many different words, but also learning the different meanings one lexical item has. Any ideas you could suggest for this?
I think that something we can do, and again, I think it's a sort of intervention that good teachers can make. As Alberto said, sometimes it's not just a question of teaching new words. It's expanding on the knowledge we have, considering the words we already know. I think that a very simple example of it is the word doctor. Most intermediate students know who a doctor is, right? But once they are reading a text, for example, and they see that the documents have been doctored, most of them are shocked because they had never seen doctor, as a verb. So what I like to do, for example, is to do it in a way that I get students to notice these, words and language, because I know that it's going to come as a surprise to them. Sometimes I like to show them, for example, like if you ask an intermediate level student, do you know the meaning of the word right? They're going to say, of course I know what right means. But then you present right in the context of within rights, by right, or right as a verb, to right a wrong. And then they're like, can I use right like this? They're taken aback because they didn't know that right can have so many different meanings. So I normally do it on purpose to shock them, like a reality. I'm not an evil teacher, Sergio, but I do it as a reality check, to get them to see, oh, so there's so much more to simple words than meets the eye.
Okay, the final question from Leila Mesquita. Is it okay to translate new vocabulary when students ask us to?
To translate? Oh, yeah, sure,
Yeah.
no problem. Yeah, I have no problem using L1 in the classroom. I have only one tiny little reservation. When we're teaching more advanced students, sometimes, of course, the translation can save time because you go straight to the point and you just say what it means. But I strongly recommend that after a certain, especially after intermediate level or pre-intermediate level, students start using not only bilingual dictionaries but also monolingual dictionaries, because depending on the word that they're going to look up, the meaning, the definition can be really nuanced. So knowing just one possible translation for that word is not enough, because the definition is something more accurate. So even though I think that translation is helpful and it can be used, definitely, but using a monolingual dictionary will help you get the nuances of the word, especially when it comes to more advanced levels.
Got it. Okay, Sergio, thank you very, very, very much for your presentation. It was a really great webinar. We can see from the amount of interaction in the chat box how amazing this was and how people really liked your presentation. Thank you very, very much.
My pleasure, Sergio. Thank you very much for the invitation.
That's great. Thank you, folks. So stay tuned for emails that we'll send to all members of the Cambridge Biosite program about the website, about our newsletters, and the next webinars. Okay, so thank you very much for being with us. Have a lovely weekend and see you next time. Bye-bye then.